The flight from Los Angeles to New York was smooth, the hum of the engines providing a steady rhythm as passengers settled into their first-class seats. Among them was a man named Eric, dressed sharply in a designer suit, his expensive watch catching the cabin lights. He was a corporate hotshot, the kind who enjoyed the privileges of wealth and never hesitated to flaunt them. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles offering drinks, Eric noticed an older man taking the seat beside him. He was dressed, simply wearing a faded jacket over a plain shirt. His hair was gray, his features rugged. There was something familiar about him, but Eric couldn't quite place it. The man nodded politely as he sat down, his demeanor calm and reserved. Eric smirked, taking a sip of his champagne. "Looks like they're letting just about anyone into first class these days," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few passengers glanced over, but the older man remained unfazed, simply fastening his seatbelt and staring ahead. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked the older man, her tone surprisingly respectful. "Just water, please," the man replied. Eric scoffed. "Water? In first class? Come on, man, live a little. You sure you even belong up here?" He chuckled, nudging his armrest. A few heads turned now, sensing the tension, but the older man remained composed. He glanced at Eric, his steely blue eyes calm. "I think I'll stick with water," he said simply. Eric shook his head, clearly enjoying himself. "Man, you look like someone's grandpa who got lost on the way to economy class." He laughed again, looking around to see if others would join in, but most seemed uncomfortable. A woman sitting across the aisle leaned in slightly. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" she asked, her voice edged with disbelief. Eric raised an eyebrow. "No, and I don't care," he said dismissively. "Why? Is he some kind of celebrity?" The woman shook her head in amazement. "That's Clint Eastwood." Silence settled over the first-class cabin. A few murmurs rippled through the seats as passengers stole glances at the man beside Eric. His face suddenly turned pale as realization dawned on him. The rugged features, the piercing gaze, the unmistakable presence, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just some random old man. This was Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the director, the icon. Eric swallowed hard. His confidence, so vibrant moments ago, seemed to drain from his body. "Oh, wow. I didn't recognize you," he stammered. I didn't mean any offense." Clint Eastwood simply gave a small, knowing smile. "No offense taken," he said calmly, sipping his water. The rest of the flight was painfully quiet for Eric. He sat stiffly in his seat, too embarrassed to say another word. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood remained as composed as ever, occasionally exchanging polite conversation with others around him. As the plane landed and passengers began gathering their belongings, Eric hesitated before standing up. He turned to Clint, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Hey, I just want to say I'm a big fan. I didn't mean to—" Clint Eastwood looked at him with a steady gaze and simply nodded. "Take care," he said, then turned and walked down the aisle. Eric sat back down, running a hand through his hair. He had spent the entire flight trying to feel superior, only to end up feeling like the smallest man in the room. As Eric sat there, still processing his humiliation, he heard quiet murmurs and chuckles from nearby passengers. His arrogance had evaporated, leaving him feeling exposed and foolish. He had just insulted one of the most respected men in Hollywood, a man who had built a legacy on grit, talent, and sheer determination. And the worst part? Eastwood hadn't even needed to put him in his place. His quiet confidence had done all the talking. Eric sighed, gathering his things and stepping into the aisle, avoiding eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed his downfall. As he walked through the terminal, he caught sight of Eastwood again, surrounded by a few fans who had respectfully approached him for photos. Unlike Eric, Clint wasn't showing off, wasn't demanding attention. He simply smiled, took a few pictures, and made his way toward the exit. Eric hesitated. A part of him wanted to disappear into the crowd, pretend the encounter had never happened. But another part of him, perhaps his conscience, told him he owed the man a genuine apology. With a deep breath, he swallowed his pride and approached the legendary actor. "Mr. Eastwood," Eric started, his voice quieter than before. The older man turned, his sharp eyes meeting Eric's. I just wanted to say I was out of line back there. I was being a jerk," Eric admitted. "I made a fool of myself, and you didn't deserve that." Clint Eastwood studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Takes a man to admit when he's wrong," he said. "Lesson learned?" Eric nodded quickly. "Absolutely." A hint of a smile played on Eastwood's face. "Good," he said simply, and with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Eric stood there for a moment, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had always prided himself on being the smartest guy in the room, the most important person in any conversation. But today, on that flight, he had learned a lesson in humility from a man who didn't need to say much to make an impact. As he left the airport, Eric made a silent vow to carry himself differently, to respect others regardless of their appearance, their age, or their quiet confidence. Because real greatness didn't need to boast, it simply existed. And if you were lucky, you got to witness it firsthand. As Eric walked toward the parking area, he replayed the entire encounter in his mind. The way Clint Eastwood had handled the situation with effortless grace was something he'd never forget. It wasn't just about being embarrassed. It was about realizing that real power and respect weren't things you demanded. They were things you earned. Sliding into his luxury sedan, Eric sat in silence for a moment before pulling out his phone. He instinctively opened his social media apps, ready to post something, but then hesitated. Normally, he'd boast about his first-class experience or drop hints about meeting a celebrity. But this time, something felt different. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Instead, he searched Clint Eastwood's name and started reading about his career. He had always known Eastwood was a big deal, but the sheer scope of his work, his films, his directing, his military service, his ability to reinvent himself over decades, left Eric feeling humbled. This wasn't just some Hollywood actor. This was a man who had seen and done more than Eric could ever imagine. The next morning, Eric arrived at his office feeling different. As he walked through the halls, he noticed how his employees reacted to him. Some looked nervous, others avoided his gaze. He had never paid much attention before, but now he saw it for what it was: fear, not respect. By lunchtime, he made a decision. Instead of eating alone in his glass-walled office like he always did, he walked into the break room and sat with his team. There was an awkward silence at first, but eventually, conversations started flowing. People relaxed. One of his assistants, Mark, hesitated before speaking. "Hey, are you okay, boss?" Eric chuckled. "Yeah, I think I am." He leaned back, realizing how strange it felt to just sit and listen instead of control the room, just learning to appreciate things a little more. The next few weeks brought more changes. Eric found himself less focused on appearances and more on substance. He treated people differently, not as stepping stones, but as individuals with their own stories. And strangely, the more he listened and respected others, the more genuine respect he received in return. One evening, after wrapping up work, he flipped on the TV and saw an old Clint Eastwood film playing. He smiled to himself as he sat down to watch. The man who had put him in his place with nothing more than a calm stare had unknowingly given him a lesson that would last a lifetime. Eric wasn't the same person who had boarded that first-class flight, and he had Clint Eastwood to thank for that. Months passed, and Eric found himself thinking about that flight more often than he expected. It wasn't just an embarrassing moment, it was a turning point. He had always measured success by wealth, status, and power, but Clint Eastwood had shown him something different. True respect wasn't about dominance, it was about character. One evening, Eric was invited to a high-profile charity gala in Los Angeles. It was the kind of event he used to love, an opportunity to network, flaunt his status, and rub shoulders with influential people. But as he stepped into the grand ballroom, something felt different. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to observe, to listen, and to appreciate the people around him. As he moved through the crowd, he heard murmurs. "Clint Eastwood is here tonight," someone whispered. Eric's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the far side of the room, and there he was, the man himself, effortlessly composed, speaking with a small group. Unlike many of the Hollywood elites around him, Clint wasn't putting on a show. He was just being himself, taking a deep breath. Eric made his way over, waiting for the right moment. Finally, as the group around Clint began to disperse, Eric stepped forward. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, offering a genuine smile. Clint turned, his eyes sharp yet kind. He gave Eric a long look, as if trying to remember where he'd seen him before. Then, after a brief pause, the slightest smirk appeared on his face. He said. "The first-class philosopher?" Eric chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, that was me." Clint gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit down, kid." Eric did as he was told, feeling like he was in the presence of a wise old gunslinger from one of Clint's classic westerns. "I never got to properly thank you," Eric admitted. "That flight, it changed me." Clint took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze steady. "People don't change unless they want to," he said. "Sounds like you wanted to." Eric nodded. "I realized I'd spent most of my life trying to be the loudest guy in the room, but you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You taught me that real strength doesn't need to be loud." Clint chuckled softly. "I didn't teach you anything. You just paid attention." For the first time in his life, Eric felt truly at peace with who he was becoming. He no longer needed to prove himself to the world. He had learned a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life, one that didn't require fame, money, or power. Just a little humility. As the night went on, Eric and Clint talked about everything, movies, life, and the lessons learned along the way. And when the evening came to an end, Clint gave him a firm nod. "Keep paying attention, kid," he said. Then, with the same quiet confidence that had changed Eric's life, Clint Eastwood walked away into the night, leaving behind nothing but wisdom and the echo of a lesson well learned. The following morning, Eric sat in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. The encounter with Clint Eastwood at the gala lingered in his mind. It wasn't just another celebrity meeting. It had become a moment of deep reflection. Clint's words stuck with him. "Keep paying attention." For years, Eric had been too caught up in his own success to notice anything else, but now he was seeing everything differently. His employees, his business, even himself. He no longer wanted to be the guy who dominated every conversation. He wanted to be the kind of leader people respected, not feared. His assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Wallace, your lunch is here." Eric looked at the gourmet meal on his desk, something he used to enjoy alone in his office. But today, he stood up, picked up his tray, and walked toward the employee lounge. The room went silent as he entered. His staff exchanged glances, unsure of what he was doing. "Mind if I join you?" Eric asked with a smile. A few hesitant nods later, he took a seat, engaging in real conversation, not just business talk, but actual human interaction. He learned about their families, their struggles, their dreams. It was something he had never bothered to do before. Weeks turned into months, and the change in Eric became noticeable. He no longer demanded respect, he earned it. His employees weren't afraid to speak up, and his company thrived like never before. Investors took notice, but more importantly, so did his staff. People worked harder, not out of fear, but because they felt valued. One evening, after wrapping up a meeting, Eric found himself in an old bookstore. He wasn't sure why he had walked in, but something drew him to a shelf filled with classic films and biographies. His eyes landed on a book about Clint Eastwood's career. He picked it up, flipping through the pages, reliving the incredible journey of a man who had defined resilience, reinvention, and quiet strength. As he read, he realized something. Clint Eastwood had never needed validation. He didn't chase approval, and yet the world respected him. Eric had spent his life doing the opposite, seeking admiration at every turn. But true power, he now understood, came from within. That night, he made a decision. He no longer wanted to be just another wealthy executive. He wanted to be someone people looked up to, not for his success, but for his character. Months later, Eric found himself on another flight, this time to San Francisco for a business retreat. He was once again seated in first class, but now, he carried himself differently. A young man in his mid-20s sat beside him, fidgeting with his phone. He had the same arrogant smirk Eric once wore. After ordering the most expensive drink on the menu, the man turned to Eric. "Man, first class sure is wasted on some people," he scoffed, eyeing an older gentleman sitting a few rows ahead. "Can't believe they let just anybody up here." Eric studied him for a moment. He saw himself, the younger version, the one who had mocked Clint Eastwood all those months ago. But this time he knew exactly what to say. He smiled. "You'd be surprised who you're sitting next to." The young man laughed. "Yeah? You know him or something?" Eric leaned back, sipping his water. "Not personally," he said. "But I once made the mistake of underestimating someone like him. And let me tell you something. Real class has nothing to do with the seat you're in." The young man frowned, confused. Eric simply smiled and returned to his drink. He didn't need to prove anything. He had learned from the best. As the plane took off, he pulled out his phone and typed a simple message to an unknown number. "Thanks for the lesson, Mr. Eastwood. I've been paying attention." He didn't expect a response. But a few minutes later, his phone buzzed. A single reply appeared on the screen. "Good. Now pass it on." Eric smiled to himself. Lesson learned. Lesson shared. And for the first time in his life, he knew he was on the right path.